Um, Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ICLG Renewable Energy and the Law webinar. My name is Blanca Reguera, and I'm the publisher of the... Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ICLG Renewable Energy and the Law webinar. My name is Blanca Reguera, and I'm the publisher of the ICLG to Renewable Energy publication, already available online. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce the speakers of this webinar, focused on the renewable energy sector. Firstly, I would like to very much introduce the moderator of this webinar, Mhairi Garcia, who is also the contributing editor of the guide, the ICLG to Renewable Energy publication. And she's also the author of the UA and the expert analysis chapters in this publication. Having said that, I would very much like to give the floor to Mhairi. So please, could you do the honors, Mhairi?
Thank you, Blanca, for your introduction, and also thank you to Globe Legal Group for putting together the ICLG Renewable Energy Law and Regulation 2021 publication. First edition of what will hopefully be the first of many and will hopefully become a helpful reference point for stakeholders in the renewable energy sector. 2020 has, of course, been an unprecedented year, and the renewable energy sector has not escaped the wrath of COVID. But amongst the challenges, there are opportunities. So let's take a step back and see where we are in terms of renewable law, renewable energy law and regulation. Today, we're privileged to be joined by a great panel, which will bring different perspectives from across the globe, from Asia and the Far East, Middle East and Africa, and Europe, and hopefully the Americas. We're going to be discussing laws and regulations applicable to the renewable energy sector, how they can promote the drive towards increasing renewables deployment, as well as the current trends in renewables law and regulation and how that is affecting the industry generally. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's panel. First, Mr. Roland Schulze. Roland is a managerial advisor, low carbon energy technologies at the European Investment Bank. He has more than 25 years of professional experience in the energy sector, having started his career in the conventional energy sector, like many of us, and expanded his professional profile via international engineering consulting. For more than a decade, he has been providing technical advisory and project appraisal services at the European Investment Bank. And he's currently the EIB's representative at the EU's Innovation Fund Expert Group. Next, Mr. Sadayuki Matsudaira. Matsudaira's son is a partner at Nishimura, and Asahi law firm in Japan, in Tokyo, with a practice focusing on the energy sector, including electricity, gas, heat supply businesses, providing legal advice for international and domestic clients on a variety of energy-related areas, such as power plants, including renewable power plants under the feed-in tariff system, LNG terminals, networks, and energy wholesale and retail businesses. He also advises on the development of projects, acquisitions, alliances, and reorganizations, the development of new businesses, and compliance with new regulations after the reform of the energy retail market. I'm especially appreciative of Matsudaira-san joining, because at the moment it's after 10 p.m. in Tokyo. So thank you, that's very much appreciated. Then moving on to Mr. Neil Cuthbert. Neil is a colleague of mine. He is a senior legal advisor at Dentons. He was formerly the managing partner of Dentons in the Middle East for a number of years, and has also been a member of the global board of Dentons. Neil has extensive experience in the energy sector, project development and financing globally, but in particular in the Middle East and in Africa. And he's advised banks, governments, borrowers, sponsors, and many other stakeholders in project financing transactions. He's also lectured extensively in a wide range of banking subjects, including Euromoney winter and summer schools on project finance, as well as authoring a number of publications. We're also hoping technology providing that we will have a fourth panelist, Ms. Mona Dajani from Pillsbury, Winthrop, and Pittman. So hopefully Mona will join us to talk about the Americas. In the meantime, let's get started. And so thank you everyone for joining us here today. Hopefully this will be an interesting webinar. I'll be asking some initial questions to the panelists, but please, there is a chat function, and so I would encourage you to submit your own questions and to broaden the discussion and make it interactive. Roland, could we start with you? Could you outline the current legal and regulatory trends that you are seeing in Europe? I know it's a very broad region, so obviously it will have to be relatively high level. But if you could outline the basis and the trends that you see and the impact of those trends on current and potential investments into renewables, please.
Sure. Thank you, Mhairi. And also thank you very much for having EIB at this interesting panel discussion. I will try to do this, although it is, as you say, indeed a very broad region, and there are many differences. Some are striking, some are expected. But before doing so, I would also like to say some brief words about what the European Investment Bank is. The European Investment Bank is a treaty-based European institution. It is a European, let's say, public body, and its role is to provide financing, mainly lending, to support the policy objectives of the European Union. At present, the bank tries to change its role, and it would like to become the European Union's climate bank, because we think that finance can play a big role in climate, and particularly in the European Union in the clean energy transition. So we could facilitate this, and we could even enable this. There is an overarching recent policy in the European Union called the EU Green Deal, and that EU Green Deal advocates for a very strong system change, and that has triggered our thinking to also adapt or change our DNA, so to transform us and our way we do business, and that thinking resulted in three very ambitious commitments, which are important for the renewable or for the energy space generally. And so to support these climate ambitions, also in the context, of course, of the Paris Agreement. So what we want to do is we want to dedicate 50% of our financing to climate action, and we want to achieve this by 2025. With our activity, we would like to trigger approximately or up to 1 trillion euros of investment in the next 10 years. And the third one, the last one, is I think even the most ambitious, is we want to align all our financing activities to the principles and the goals of the Paris Agreement by the end of this year, which is not far away. It's quite close, but we are on a good road. When it comes to regulations in the energy space, let me narrow it a bit down and focus on renewable energy regulations, because there are many others. In the European Union, the regulations are in the various member states are actually governed by what is set at the union level. So, and this had been done already maybe 10 years ago, approximately, where there was a so-called Directive Renewable Energy Directive, which indicated what kind of national frameworks member states should implement. Whilst at the time that regulation was quite general, let's say, and the member states had all degrees of freedom to set their regulations internally. The objective, though, of the European directive and then also the national directives or laws and regulations was to provide financial support in one way or the other to renewable energy projects, so as to increase the share of that type of energy production in the system. So there were so-called feed-in tariffs per technology, and member states governments had the possibility to put emphasis on the various technology, maybe according to their climatic conditions or their topography. And other countries at the time, they had chosen a more market-oriented, market-based methodology regulation, and they introduced so-called green certificates. All these measures, the overarching EU directive and then the national regulations, they allowed a boom of renewable energy across Europe. And to, how can I say, regulate that boom a bit further, the European Union had then introduced some state aid guidelines to control or to moderate funding to that sector. And that guidelines then had clear, how can I say, instructions to not overspend public budget to these technologies. Quite recently, so 2 years ago, that the European directive was revised and had made clear that support schemes have to be organized at national level again. But that directive then required from member states in the European Union to adapt their existing regulations away from fixed, legally granted feed-in tariffs or market-based green certificate systems to more auctions, to more market-based, to more market-responsive systems, to ask member states to launch tenders through which they then could offer market premiums as the standard. And we are still in a kind of a transition period, but this has been now largely implemented in many of the member states. That change has a number of impacts on renewable energy and the application of it. The most obvious change through that regulation is that renewable energy projects are now more exposed to market forces. They need to be more competitive. That is good for the consumers, of course, because more competition has an impact on cost and hence prices. But still, for investors, it imposes a risk as such. Even still, then after an auction, legally guaranteed support may not result in an attractive return, let's say. I can briefly probably indicate some of the main design elements of the current regulation, which are first of all that the European Union leaves it open to member states whether they would like to be technology specific, so to say the member state just would like to support one renewable energy technology, say solar or wind or ocean or something, or whether it should be open. But the directive quite clearly says there need to be some qualification criteria when such a support needs to be awarded. For example, the permitting status or the quality of the project and so on and so on. As I said, generally, the directive outlines that support should be awarded under competitive conditions, but the fine details can be different. So we see across Europe, how can I say, 4 types of such mechanisms. So there's a feed-in tariff. There's number 2 is feed-in premium or contract for difference. There's still some member states which have quotas or green certificates, and some which provide support in form of an investment grant. So the market exposure of an investment would increase from feed-in tariff, where it would be the lowest, to an investment grants. The directive also indicates that the national regulations should limit the tenor of such support, so it can't be indefinite, but it should be at least 5 and should not extend to more than 30 years. The average tenors for such support in the various member states seems to be around 10, in some cases, in some countries, even 20 years. A number of issues are not regulated, and that poses also issues from an investment banking perspective. For example, how will investors be compensated in case other regulations, for example, permit regulations, will impose curtailments of the operation of the assets, and also then impacts from the wholesale market. So we see situations in the European Union where the wholesale market results in negative prices. That could be an issue in the context of when a member state has chosen a contract for difference systems. I would say I'd leave it here and can come back to more details later. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. And it's really interesting as well to hear about the shift from the bank. As you said, you want to change your DNA. And perhaps if we've time at the end for questions, we can delve a little bit more into that, as well as the impact in the move towards a more market-based regulatory regime. Maybe moving across to Japan and the Far East and Asia. So Matsudaira-san, could you introduce us to the legal and regulatory environment that you see in Japan, and also to the extent that you're able, a little bit more broadly in the region, and some of the trends that you've been seeing?
Thank you. My name is Sadayuki Matsudaira of Nishimura and Asahi, Tokyo, Japan. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I first would like to the general overview of the renewable sector in Japan. So Japan, as you know, in 2011, we had a big earthquake and also the Fukushima nuclear plant accident. And until then, Japan relied about 20 or 30% electricity on nuclear power plants. But after the Fukushima accident, basically most of those plants stopped. So we basically lost 20% electricity. And we also faced a planned blackout due to the scarcity of electricity. The government at that time introduced feed-in tariff in 2012 to partly to meet the electricity demands, which lost about 20%. And so in 2012, so basically under the feed-in tariff, the project owners are entitled to sell the renewable electricity generally for 20 years at a fixed price. And for solar projects, for example, in 2012, the purchase price was 40 Japanese yen per kilowatt hour. By the way, $1 equals to basically 100 Japanese yen. So which means that the purchase price per kilowatt hour was 40 US cents at that time. So very high purchase price. And since then in Japan, we had kind of solar bubble. And the kilowatt capacity became about 6 times or 7 times when compared with 2012 in 2018. So a lot of solar projects we have now, and substantial portion of them are from foreign investment. So European or US or Asian investors investing in Japanese solar projects. And now the government policy again on the solar is a bit changed. So we have too many solar projects. So now the government is strengthening the regulation on solar projects. An example is, so Japanese government introduced a new regulation to obligate the solar project owners to have reserves for decommissioning, or more strict deadline for COD, and also the compliance with the local regulations. Other resources, for example, biomass. We also had kind of biomass bubble as well. So now we have double capacity when compared with 2012. The purchase price of biomass in 2012 was 24 yen. So still, this is relatively high globally. And we had a lot of biomass projects. And but again, we had too many biomass projects, and the government is not so like biomass projects anymore. And but purchase price was reduced now, basically 19 Japanese yen per kilowatt hour, and also introduced auction system. And so basically the project owners must win in the auction process. So by the way, so for solar projects, as I said, in 2012, the purchase price was 40 yen. But now Japanese government introduced auction system on mega solar projects, and now purchase price is 12 Japanese yen. So less than 1/3 in the purchase price. Also, so we have a lot of onshore wind projects, but the purchase price on onshore projects was not so good when compared with solar or biomass. So we have not so many wind projects. And the Japanese government now would like to introduce more wind projects. And also in 2018, Japan introduced a new act which enabled project developers to dominantly use a certain ocean area in general ocean area for 30 years. Since then, we did not have laws which enable project developers to dominantly use ocean area for offshore wind projects. But now we have such mechanisms. And we know that in Europe and also Taiwan in Asia, there are a lot of offshore projects, and Japan would like to, follow that trend, and then started the auction process to get the offshore projects. And maximum purchase price in offshore project is 29 Japanese yen, basically means 29 cents in US dollar. So globally, that's a good number. And also, again, so for solar projects and biomass projects maybe as well, the feed-in premium system will apply from 2022. So again, the Japanese government is not so kind to solar and biomass projects anymore. So government would like to integrate the system for solar and biomass projects as well into the market mechanism. So that's a general tendency in the regulation. So we will have more offshore projects, offshore wind projects, but solar and biomass, we will have more the secondary trade transactions, but not so many greenfield projects. That's a general overview in Japan. Thanks.
Apologies. Thank you, Matsudaira-san. I think it's a really helpful reminder as well that the initial drivers in Japan were quite different following Fukushima.
Yeah.
And obviously you had a very strong feed-in tariff initially, which led to this solar bubble and then also the biomass bubble, and how that has evolved now to an auction system with a more market-orientated mechanism. And I suppose it's a similar trend in a way, but as I said, the initial driver is quite different from what we saw in Europe, of course. And it's interesting as well that I think in terms of new developments, the opportunities that you see are going to be more in offshore wind. And for solar and biomass, it's going to be much more on the secondary market. Finally, on to the Middle East and Africa. Neil, could you give us some background on the legal and regulatory environment there and the trends that you're seeing? You're still on mute, Neil.
Thank you. Yes, so my focus is the Middle East and Africa, but given the time constraints, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the Middle East, and in particular the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Oman, which are the three countries here in the Middle East that are the furthest forward in the renewables journey. But I'll also, if time permits, cover some stuff on Egypt as well. So first, just sort of looking at sort of the landscape in each of these key jurisdictions. I mean, taking the UAE first, I mean, here large-scale utility renewable energy projects are procured mostly through government-owned entities. The government, whether it's at a federal or an emirate level, has a controlling interest in utility-scale projects. The private sector is permitted to partner with government entities in order to generate electricity, typically holding an interest of 40 or 49%. However, this is currently limited to generation only. The key deliverables for the UAE Energy Strategy 2050 is for the UAE to produce 50% of its energy targets from clean sources. This strategy sort of breaks down into sort of roughly 44% renewable energy, 6% nuclear, which has just been commissioned in Abu Dhabi for the first time, 38% natural gas, and 12% from clean fossil energy. Adding more clean energy to the mix also means a decreased reliance on natural gas, which currently accounts for more than 2/3 of the UAE's primary energy source. So this energy transition takes into account the international environmental commitments made by the UAE, as well as economic planning and growth across the various business sectors. Turning now to Saudi Arabia. In Saudi, the government plays a key role in developing the renewable energy and policy commitments towards renewable energy through government-controlled companies. Under the Saudi Vision 2030 policy, Saudi aims to produce 58.7 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030, with an initial target of generating approximately 27 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2024. The 2030 target is divided into 40 gigawatts of PV, 16 gigawatts of wind, and the remaining 3 gigawatts of CSP. Saudi, as you will appreciate, is one of the most hydrocarbon-rich countries in the world. It holds almost a fifth of the world's total proved oil reserves. And according to the British Petroleum Statistical Review published earlier this year, accounted for over 12% of global oil production in 2019. Notwithstanding this, the Saudi government has set ambitious renewable energy targets, and the main drivers for change are to diversify local energy sources and free up hydrocarbon resources for local industrial use or export, stimulate economic development within Saudi, and reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Turning now to Oman, under the sector law in Oman, the government through OPWP procures the development of new capacity, renewables or otherwise, through a competitive process in which local and foreign developers and sponsors participate. The government doesn't currently own any renewable energy facilities. Generation facilities, including those using renewable energy sources, are wholly owned by private developers, many of them foreign developers. The government has announced that it aims to have 30% of Oman's electricity demands produced through renewable energy by 2030. So more than 2/3 of this are likely to be met by solar energy, with the remainder met by wind and waste to energy. The main drivers in Oman for the transition towards renewable energy are to increase the amount of environmentally friendly technologies, to diversify away from conventional fossil fuel reliant energy. This has become increasingly important in Oman in recent years as the government expects the supply of natural gas to reduce over the next decade due to the increased cost of gas production and the dwindling of Oman's gas reserves. Lastly, on this first bit is Egypt. The Egyptian government has a long-term plan for the diversification of its energy mix and the reduction of dependence upon fossil fuels, which predates, in fact, the large offshore gas discovery made by Egypt. The targeted renewable capacity is 20% of the energy mix by 2022, and that breaks down to sort of 12% wind, 6% hydro, and 2% solar, and 42% renewables by 2035, which breaks down to approximately 22% solar, 14% PV, 4% wind, and 2% hydro. The main drivers for change in Egypt are believed to be that following the huge blackouts they had in electricity supply during the troubles that Egypt experienced in the 2011 uprisings, led to a development which followed that they needed a greater plan to diversify the energy mix adopted by the country. And this has led to a substantial expansion of installed capacity from solar PV and wind in particular. So looking now at sort of the current legal and regulatory trends, in the UAE, there is both federal and Emirati level laws and regulations which govern renewable energy. It has developed policies to diversify its economy away from oil and gas. And the UAE has launched its energy strategy 2050 in 2017, the first unified energy strategy in the UAE based on supply and demand, which aims to deliver clean, secure, affordable energy and reduce greenhouse gases. In addition, strategies have been set at emirate level. For example, Dubai has an energy strategy 2050, which includes even more ambitious targets than the UAE energy strategy. The UAE has also introduced a number of laws at federal and emirate level to regulate and generate transmission and distribution of renewable energy. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, there is no current regulatory framework in place specific to the generation transmission of renewable energy. The generation, transmission, and distribution of energy, of electricity generally, is what's called an electricity activity, and is therefore regulated by the Electricity and Cogeneration Regulatory Authority, or ECRA, and governed by the electricity law and the implementing registration regulations. There's currently also no regulatory framework in place that is specific to the sale of utility scale renewable power. Trading in electricity, including the sale, purchase, import, or export is included in electrical energy, regardless of whether it derives from conventional or renewable sources. Oman, on the other hand, the sector law there that I mentioned earlier regulates the generation, transmission, and distribution of renewable energy. And it's the same law that governs the provision of electricity through conventional means. In regard to the sale of utility scale renewable power, and this is done by way of a competitive tender process under the sector law and purchased by OPWP under long-term power purchase agreements. And lastly, looking at Egypt, the renewable energy policy and regulations are established by several important pieces of legislation in that country. The most important of which is the Renewable Energy Law, published in December 2014, which identifies four main mechanisms for the development of renewable energy projects. First is state-owned projects with competitive bidding for engineering, procurement, and construction contracts. Secondly, competitive bidding for build, own, operate contracts. Thirdly, feed-in tariffs. And fourthly, a merchant scheme according to which independent power producers can enter into bilateral contracts to sell power directly to consumers using the national grid against wheeling and grid access charges payable to the grid operator. And then lastly, the electricity law in Egypt, published in 2015, and the regulations made thereunder encourage energy efficiency and generation of electricity from renewable sources, and provides for sort of a complete interdependence of the activities of generation, distribution, and transmission to achieve a liberalized and competitive market. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. It's refreshing how hydrocarbon-rich countries are actually setting ambitious renewable energy targets and diversification goals, notwithstanding the abundance of conventional resources that they have. And I think what's also interesting is that these different jurisdictions that you've mentioned and the drivers that they have are actually quite different between the different countries, even though they're neighboring each other and so on, or close by. Maybe just a little aside, I think it was Egypt that built the world's first solar power plant over 100 years ago in 1912, 1913. So they did actually get in early on in the game, a little hiatus in between. So let's move on from there and address perhaps the elephant in the room, the impact of COVID-19, but not just the impact of COVID-19. I'd like to understand a little bit more about where the renewable energy sector is going. In terms of COVID, obviously, we've seen a large impact. Supply chains have been impacted. We've seen lockdowns. We've seen payment delays, and projects have also been sometimes put on hold, perhaps even cancelled. Neil, could you start perhaps with giving us some thoughts on the impact of the regulatory and legal trends in the sector, and whether there's any shift in developments and investment patterns due to COVID-19, and more generally where the market is going and where you expect us to be in the next few years?
Sure. So I'll first talk about sort of the current status of sort of current and potential projects, and then I'll sort of flip in and talk a little bit about the impact of COVID. Again, I'm going to stick to the same order of the same countries: UAE, Oman, and Saudi, and then time permitting, say a few words about Egypt as well, by way of a contrast. So, I mean, starting with the UAE, the main types of renewable energy deployed in the UAE is solar energy. In particular, Dubai and Abu Dhabi have pursued sort of ambitious solar energy projects as part of their energy diversification strategies, with large utility scale solar PV and concentrated CSP projects. Looking at Dubai in 2014, phase 2 of Dubai's Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum solar park was tendered initially as a 100 megawatt solar PV power project. That project achieved a then, I think, world record breaking tariff in the absence of subsidies. And that project doubled its size to 200 megawatts, becoming operational in 2017. Phase 3 of that project followed in 2016, a massive 800 megawatts of PV and another record-breaking tariff. And again followed in 2017 by phase 4, a 700 megawatt CSP project, subsequently upsized to 950 megawatts. And that has a 100 megawatt CSP tower, 600 megawatt CSP parabolic trough, and a 250 megawatt PV. This is the largest single site CSP project in the world, and it's really on a massive scale and to be seen, to be believed almost. In 2019, 900 megawatt phase 5 of that project was tendered, attracting at that time the lowest ever tariff bid for a solar PV project in the world, with the project being awarded earlier this year in 2020. Not to be outdone by its neighbor, Abu Dhabi in 2019 launched the Swayhan Solar PV power project, which was tendered back in 2016, and that became operational last year, having previously achieved, again, no surprise, a record tariff. And the project was upsized from 350 megawatts to a colossal 1,177 megawatts in 2017. And most recently, Abu Dhabi tendered a 2 gigawatt solar plant in Al Dhafra in 2019, which was awarded earlier this year. For the UAE, I mean, these ambitious targets are encouraging widespread investment in renewable energy projects across the UAE. However, distributed energy rooftop solar investment is limited as a result of the applicable regulations, and foreign investment is limited by rules and regulations governing how much an individual company can own. So a very ambitious and exciting sort of landscape, if you like, here in the UAE. Saudi Arabia, the main types of renewable energy which Saudi is seeking to deploy are solar energy, no surprise there really, including solar PV and CSP, wind power, geothermal energy, and waste to energy. To date, the emphasis has been on utility scale projects using solar PV energy and onshore wind power, with limited activity in respect of solar rooftop projects. KSA's 2030 target includes solar, wind, waste to energy, and CSP. According to the government and IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, Saudi's renewable energy sources currently make up less than 1% of the country's total energy generation capacity. However, the Saudis aim to raise that percentage to at least 30%, and has shown strong evidence that it's moving along that target. Oman, renewable energy projects remain relatively new in Oman. The main type of renewable energy, again, like Saudi, is solar, followed by wind energy. The Dhofar wind power project, comprising 13 wind turbines developed by General Electric, with a total capacity of 50 megawatts, is located in Harweel, began generating electricity in August last year. Smaller wind-based schemes are envisioned in Sharqiya, Al Dukum, and Dhofar zones, and the government through OPWP plans to procure wind energy through IPPs. OPWP has awarded a 500 megawatt PV IPP, which reached financial close in March 2020, earlier this year. They have also announced plans to procure 2 further solar PV projects with a combined capacity exceeding 1,000 megawatts. The list of qualified bidders for those 2 projects was issued earlier this year in January. And then lastly, Egypt. Since the launch of the feed-in tariff program in 2014, Egypt has seen a boost in its renewable generation capacity, especially in respect of solar PV and wind power generation. As of late 2019, the installed renewable energy capacities in Egypt were 2,830 megawatts of hydropower, nearly 1,500 megawatts of solar PV, 1,375 megawatts of wind power, 140 megawatts of CSP, and a small amount of biomass projects. Private businesses, especially small renewable energy developers, have played a bigger role than the government in the promotion of renewable energy in Egypt. Their business development work has created an appetite in the market, especially with commercial and industrial off-takers for renewable energy. So moving on to sort of the impact of COVID on these various jurisdictions. Due to COVID-19, the level of investment in the energy sector in the UAE has obviously declined. The Arab Petroleum Investments Corporation, APICOR, expects that energy investments in the MENA, Middle East and North Africa region will fall by a staggering $73 billion between 2020 and 2024. Given the heavy dependence on foreign direct investment, the UAE has taken several steps towards sort of mitigating the risk of the impact of COVID, which is especially important since they have this clean energy target of 21% by the end of next year. I guess most significantly, the UAE cabinet has approved an economic stimulus package of nearly $35 billion as part of the federal government to support the Emirati national economy generally. And part of, whilst this package is not specifically for renewables, part of this package will undoubtedly be used to meet these ambitious targets, particularly in the UAE and in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Turning now to Saudi Arabia, the government tenders have been and continue to be a great success, even during 2020 and post-COVID. PIF, which is the Public Investment Fund, has backed a number of initiatives which have been very successful in attracting developers for large-scale, multifaceted utility-style projects. Assuming this trend is going to continue in Saudi, they are well on their way to meeting their ambitious renewable energy targets, even in the absence of, as I mentioned earlier, specific renewables laws and regulations to promote utility scales renewables. In 2020, plans were announced for a green hydrogen plant in Saudi Arabia. This plant will be powered by 4 gigawatts of wind and solar power, and when completed, is expected to produce 650 tons of green hydrogen daily. This fuel will be shipped as ammonia to end markets globally, then converted back to hydrogen. Ammonia production is expected to start around 2025. Oman has had some issues at a political level affecting its procurement drive due to the COVID pandemic. Nevertheless, I think there are hopes that this will not affect OPWP and its 1 gigawatt plus solar program. which has 9 pre-qualified consortia chasing 2 projects, MANA 1, which is a 500 to 600 megawatt IPP, and then MANA 2, which is a similar sized IPP as well, both solar, I should say. Each project will be awarded to separate consortia, and much like the latest Saudi round, an extra long period of bidding time was given to reflect the disruption caused by the pandemic, and RFP bids are due in a couple of weeks' time, I believe. Lastly, but by no means least, Egypt. It's currently expected that the next round in the power project, which will substantially expand the use of renewable energy in Egypt, will be the wave of transformation to electric mobility and green hydrogen, as well as integrating renewable generation in water treatment and desalination plants. Power to X in general has the potential in Egypt of preventing potential setbacks due to the COVID-19 pandemic or the existence of unused capacity on the national grid. So I think that's just a brief summary of where we are. I mean, I think in general, one can say that despite the pandemic, it's, whilst not quite business as usual, all of these countries have got ambitious targets in the renewable space. And whilst there have been some setbacks, I think it's quite encouraging to see that, that the government and foreign investment is continuing to drive towards these very ambitious government targets across the region.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks for covering so many countries. And obviously, it's interesting to hear the mega size of, or sizes of the projects that are being procured and are coming online in the Middle East, particularly, you know, when you mentioned the size of the projects being upsized. You know, it's interesting to hear. And I think we've also seen sort of record tariffs along with those upsizing of projects. I suppose in many ways, the Middle East has been playing catch up. And so, although there's a clear challenge from COVID, the positive message is that projects are not being put on hold. You know, they're still continuing from what you say. So that I think is positive. Matsudaira-san, are you seeing a similar pattern in Japan and more generally in the region? And I suppose, has COVID-19 accelerated or challenged the market-based approach that you mentioned?
Yes, thank you. So in Japan, in short, less solar biomass project and more offshore wind project. That's a trend. And so now solar project developers are trying to find a new business model which develop their project without relying on feed-in tariff or feed-in premium. So we call such business model PPA business model. So basically, the project developers enters into PPA directly with consumers. And so developers set up solar PV panels in on-site, so consumers' place, and supply electricity in one site to the consumer's factory or something. And so in such case, wheeling service fee will not take. So even if the project developer does not use a feed-in tariff or premium, they can develop the project by getting the certain purchase price from the consumers. Also, we see more projects with battery. So in especially the solar projects, and yes, and storage, and in the future maybe more projects with using hydrogen, for example, producing hydrogen by using the solar or renewable electricity. But that's a future target. By the way, recently the Japanese Prime Minister announced that Japan will aims carbon neutral in 2050. And again, we will not, enjoy the nuclear power plants so much due to our accident experience. So we will need to have more renewable projects. So for project developers, the difficulty in Japanese market is how to get the grid connection. We see a lot of projects. We have a lot of projects, but the good area for wind projects, for example, is northeast side of Japan. But in that area, less population and less grid. So the offshore wind project developers generally have difficulty to get the grid connection, and it takes time and costs to have the negotiation with the grid operators. Also, the curtailment, especially in southeast west side of Japan, we have a lot of solar projects, and now the project developers must suffer the unlimited curtailment. So in order for the Japan to have more renewable projects and to achieve the carbon neutral in 2050, the Japan as a country must develop more grid and more technology to efficiently manage the grid. And that's our issue. So we would like to see how the discussion will continue. And in relation to the COVID-19, as you may know, Japan and Asia, like Korea or China, have not so heavily suffered from COVID. And the economic situation is getting better now. But still, it is reasonable to understand that, for example, especially for foreign investors, it is difficult to make the on-site due diligence and technical due diligence, operational due diligence in these circumstances. So definitely the investment from outside Japan is not so many when compared with previous period. And also money from financial investors also not so many when compared with before. So we have some damage, but hopefully the situation will improve. Yes, that's the situation in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you, Matsudaira-san. And it's positive, whilst there's challenges around COVID, obviously, I think from what you're saying is that it is relatively limited. And obviously, it's not just in Japan that we're seeing challenges around storage, around grid development, grid stabilization, particularly where there's been widespread deployment of solar PV and wind and so on. So it's interesting, to hear how that's obviously a priority, but I think it's not just a priority in Japan. I think it's something that we're seeing sort of in a number of countries around the world where there's been a big emphasis and a big deployment of renewables that obviously then needs to go with it, that we're looking to find some sort of solution for storage on a large scale that's efficient from a technology and a cost perspective. Before moving on to Roland, could I just remind all participants that we actually have a Q&A box, so please feel free to post questions to the panelists. As I said, they're covering a large area around the globe, so it's quite interesting, and I think we're getting some nice different perspectives. But also we'd love to hear questions coming from the floor, so please don't be shy and do submit your questions, and hopefully we can get to some of them. So moving on to Roland, what have you seen in terms of renewable energy market and in Europe, and where do you think it's going, and how has COVID-19 impacted on it? I know you've already given sort of an introduction as to how the regulations have required it to move to a more market-based approach, and also have put clear long stop dates in terms of incentives. But I'd be interested to hear sort of the impact that has had on the market as well as COVID.
All right, so I'm unmuted. Great. Thank you for the question. That's always a technology challenge. Sorry. Yeah, thank you for these two questions. Let me start with COVID-19 first, which is I mean, in the region, the European region, a a country-specific issue, because health protection and pandemic management is managed nationally, and even there, in some federally structured countries, it has to be managed regionally or even by municipalities. So that is a challenge sometimes, but I think also it is an advantage, because one can then better react to the local circumstances and the local, say, infection rates. I'd like to also sound the one issue we just heard on COVID impacts in Japan and foreign direct investment. Which is actually a similar impact we have at the bank at the moment. So we can't do due diligence. So we can't visit our investors. We can't travel. We can't do operational due diligence and all these elements. So this is an impact of COVID-19, but it's of course not necessarily an impact on the renewable energy sector. As a reaction to the pandemic, the bank has established a kind of a funding program for small and medium scale enterprises, and we have thereby injected liquidity into these, so that the SMEs do not suffer even more from the situation. So there are plenty of COVID loans granted and given to SMEs across the European Union. And then in terms of renewable energy projects and renewable energy investments suffering from COVID, I should say should say differentiate between those who are still under development and say, prior to implementation, and those which are operating. So those which are operating, they might potentially suffer from the decline in energy demand. So that could be an issue. I don't have a proper indicator for that, whether this is indeed an issue, but this is a thinkable issue. So lower energy demand and then also stability of the energy system might require to not operate all renewable energy capacity, and there could be curtailments, and hence then lesser revenues with all the subsequent impacts on these projects. Whilst we haven't seen that, although I think on average there is forecasts and predictions of that economies will shrink by, I don't know, 5 to 7% generally in the European Union member states. For those in implementation or under construction even, the impacts of COVID-19, there might be various. So slow permitting because of authorities have different things to do than to grant permits, or that companies can't access the construction sites, or workers are not available, staff is not available because of sickness and so on and so on. I think that these elements are probably unavoidable, but we haven't seen much, or say we don't have a very good indicator which would confirm either that there is no impact or there is an impact. So we have anecdotally heard some events, but that didn't indicate a general trend. But I think what we will see is that the electricity demand, reduction in electricity demand will have a significant impact on the use of renewables. In terms of investment and markets and the development of markets, so through the last decade, investments in renewable energy on an annual average, I think in the European Union was quite stable. So it was probably, in terms of capacity, let's say, it was around 10 to 15 gigawatts per year across the European Union. We could observe a slight dip in 2018, 2017, 2018, when the regulation I was referring to earlier changed. So that's then required perhaps an adaptation on the investor side to get more familiar with how to respond to such a regulatory change. Also, I think, well, there's different investments in the last year and in the beginning of this year in the various member states, but this is, I think, also not driven by COVID impacts. It's rather driven by different incentives or by the topography and climate conditions in these member states. And quite frankly, what we see at present in our own activities and in our lending volumes to the renewable energy sector is it seems to go into the same levels, towards the same levels than it was in the past, European-wide. So there is not a kind of a halt, a stop of investments, so it seems to continue. However, there might be some impacts more towards the future, because the European Union has given itself CO2 reduction targets, as many other regions and countries as well. And these CO2 reduction targets, which are for 2030 and 2050, they would require, in the first instance for 2030, to approximately double the capacity, so double the investment, let's say, from the 10 to 15 gigawatts. To double the annual pattern, I should say, to double the annual pattern of the investments to achieve that CO2 targets, and then to get towards the CO2 targets 2050, that in annual pattern of investments would have to probably even triple or quadruple to get there. In concrete numbers, it means 30 to 35 billion euros per year in renewable energy investments by 2030, and then thereafter 50 to 65 billion euros per year up to 2030, 2050. So whether that will be achievable or whether that will be slowed down due to COVID and lower energy demand is a question. But also here, we don't see any yet, I have to say, any particular concrete indicator. I mentioned this already, and I was just looking again on my numbers here. So the lending volume for renewable energy projects of ourselves, up to say the last month approximately over the year, is approximately the same volume than it was in last year. So we don't see yet any massive impact from that pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland, and I think it's quite a positive message that, at least for now, the impact is, you either don't see it or it's limited. We have one question here, which perhaps we could just stay with you if you could answer it, which is, how do you see the future of nuclear energy in Europe? So where do you see that going?
Well, in the European Union, the employing nuclear energy is legally under a Euratom, and that gives discretion to member states to either use it or not use it. There are countries who have clearly decided to opt out of nuclear. Germany, for example, to phase it out. I think even as in the wake of the accident in Asia. Other countries, they still bet on nuclear. France. Has 3/4 of France energy generation is nuclear based. So that's difficult to say from my perspective how the nuclear energy would develop. I think at present there's no concrete project ongoing, yeah, as EIB we would have to respect and honor the content and the content of the Euratom agreement, and if there would be a proposal, we would have to carefully consider it. Yeah, of course we also see the discussion that nuclear could contribute being a CO2-free generator to achieving the CO2 targets. Also in its scale, it can theoretically contribute to support electricity storage and as a cheap energy, maybe cheap energy source for battery storage or hydrogen storage. I mean, there are many reflections around this, but ultimately, I think these are national policy decisions and objectives which one would have to honor.
Thank you, Roland. I'd just like to also now introduce Mona Dajani. Thank you for joining us, Mona. I did promise at the start that we were going to be trying to cover the globe, which is quite ambitious of us. But I'm very pleased to say that we now have a representative from the Americas here. Mona is a partner at Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw and Pittman, and she advises on complex acquisitions, dispositions, financing and project development transactions involving energy and infrastructure facilities in the US and around the world. And she has a particular passion for renewables. So I'm very pleased, Mona, that you were able to join us. And we've had some interesting insights, which hopefully you can listen to later from Japan, from the Middle East, from Europe. And so I'm pleased that we now hopefully can have a little bit of time for some insights from you. Perhaps we could just have a little bit of background in terms of where we are in terms of renewable energy in the US, but also the broader Americas, and where do you think it's going? We were talking a bit about the sort of future of renewable energy and how it's been impacted, not just by COVID, but generally by a general shift away from sort of fixed feed-in tariff, sort of very favorable regimes, but towards more market-orientated, market-based systems. I hand over to Mona. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm very pleased to be invited and to share the stage, so to speak, with so many experts in their field here that are on a global basis. This is very interesting. For the United States, and thank you for that introduction too. That was very generous. I lead the Energy and Infrastructure Global Group from New York City in normal times. And I specialize, because it's my passion, as you said, in renewable energy, all forms of renewable energy. And I also, because I'm qualified in the UK, in England and Wales, I, in normal times, would come very much to Europe, where I would primarily represent companies that would be wanting to come to the United States or the Americas, primarily in renewable energy. So, I have a global perspective, not just from Europe, but from Asian companies too, but the focus is in, for me at least, here in the United States. I think we can't talk about renewable energy in the United States without talking about the huge shift in the administration, the presidential administration that's going to be happening in January with a new president, which is Joe Biden. he has set up day one priorities for his incoming administration. And one of those priorities is out of the four big ones, which is it's climate change and increasing clean energy investments here in the United States. And both renewable energy and energy storage trade groups, providers of grid infrastructure and technologies, and groups representing corporations committed to reducing the carbon footprint have issued congratulations, and we're very excited. I could tell you that he has laid out an ambitious, comprehensive approach to energy policy that recognizes renewable energy ability to grow in the American economy and create a cleaner environment. Let me just go over a little bit about what his plan is, and then I can talk about some other new areas for the United States that all of you have already been doing, which is fairly new here, and it's in infancy. So the first is that the United States is going to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. It's going to reverse Trump administration actions that had weakened automotive and appliance efficiency standards. And it will be directing federal and energy agencies to buy clean power. There is still, because the US Senate is still controlled by the Republicans, it's unclear whether the Democrats will have a majority in both houses. And if it's not a majority, there will be some opposition to Biden's ambitious clean energy plan, which, his cornerstone is to have invest $2 trillion to drive decarbonization of the energy sector by 2035 and dramatically reduce emissions from transportations and buildings. So there still remains plenty that the Biden administration can do without support from the Republicans in Congress. It can order agencies to streamline and support permitting and leasing policies. For example, we have some small offshore wind projects which are being planned on the East Coast. But unlike, I think, the rest of the world, here in the United States, the federal government will become a bigger buyer of renewable energy and electric vehicles. There is talk that Biden will probably appoint a new chair for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and nominate replacement commissioners that could reverse decisions that have created challenges for state clean energy policies. We are urging Biden to work together with this, closely divided Congress to incorporate energy efficiency into recovery packages. There is also, we have a very old power grid, and we are also looking at a top priority for the United States to have a massive investment in infrastructure to keep energy and the water and gas and grids safe and reliable. Now, interestingly, here in the United States, there is one of the ways that Biden is going to boost renewable energy investment is through a coronavirus pandemic relief bill, which would be part of an energy and infrastructure stimulus package, which would still need to be have support by Congress. So meaning that we would need the House of Representatives and Senate. So both houses would have to support this. And there is strong support from the Republicans and from for this type of bill. It's a matter of how much would be provided to clean energy and infrastructure. But there is some bipartisan support that we need to have a boost for transmission to unlock more solar and wind capacity, and that that would also call for federal tax incentives, which would be in the form of tariffs and tax credits. There is a investment tax credit for solar that is set to expire over the next 4 years. And the request, and this is on the table, is to include key extensions to bolster investment in projects and extend some of these tax credits. This investment tax credit, there's also a production tax credit that's available for wind. The big cornerstone for this plan for the stimulus package by Biden that he's going to be introducing is, to combat climate change is jobs, is the ability to create thousands of well-paying jobs across the United States. And, we are looking at the Biden administration to introduce tax policies that pave the way for greater adoption of renewable energy. There are specific tax incentives I talked about for wind and solar. There's also tax incentives on the table for energy storage that could help boost technologies that are needed to integrate the rising share and projects that we're seeing of intermittent, solar and wind power. And we expect to see strong support from the Biden administration that's focused on as well electric and the transportation sector, which will drive further deployment of the energy storage. At this point, it is unclear if expanding tax credits or proposals to convert those credits to direct pay or cash grant options to increase their value will win this bipartisan support. But we do know that there is acceptance of long-term goals such as federal carbon pricing mechanisms and a clean energy standard that are gaining support. So in the longer term, we'll need to turn to ambitious. We are returning to an ambitious climate agenda that builds on state renewable energy standards and also federal programs. We're seeing incentives also being introduced for not only wind, solar, energy storage, but also electric vehicles, mobility, hydrogen, and it's all giving a level playing field for clean energy in the tax code. And there's a major effort now to expand and upgrade the nation here in the US, our antiquated transmission structure. So I'm still going to be very bullish. There's a lot of new developments also in hydrogen here in the US, and there has been a long history of bipartisan support for renewable power. So I look forward to working on this with policymakers on both sides of the aisle. In terms of what is new here in the States, I mentioned about there's offshore wind, and there is a big growing push for hydrogen. I don't know if I have time now to go into the hydrogen, or you want me to you want me to stop here? Okay, no questions. I guess I will. I will talk a little bit about. Why don't I talk what's really big here in the United States? One of the biggest that we see, which has already been already in your respective countries in Asia and Europe. In the United States, we have it's new here, but we're at the forefront of a green hydrogen industry here to decarbonize our electric transportation and industrial sectors. And there's been some major investments and policy changes that are going to be enable hydrogen in the United States, which is in its infancy, unlike the rest of you, to reach its full potential. We are seeing here in the U.S. Major oil companies, automakers, hydrogen producers, fuel cell manufacturers and utilities really pushing the U.S. government to follow the lead of the EU and Asia, in particular Japan and South Korea, in making major commitments to building infrastructure here to grow its green hydrogen capacity. We believe that here in the United States, that hydrogen could probably supply about 15% of the country's energy needs by 2050, including hard to electrify sectors that are dependent on natural gas, such as high heat industrial processes, converting gas turbines to use that supply power to use hydrogen. And hydrogen would also be used to power fuel cells. It would augment battery-powered vehicles in decarbonizing the transportation sector, particularly those vehicles that require long range and fast fueling times, such as long-haul trucks. We have a lot of companies here in the United States that that we are working with that do fleet and trucks, you know, in the automotive industry. And we are also seeing that you know, we are, although there's, you know, wind and solar is combining with hydrogen here, we're also seeing, and I know we talked about this a little bit, nuclear power too, that, you know, that we're looking at hydrogen applications that could, you know, because they don't need to be used to electrolyze water to generate hydrogen in the power natural gas fired turbines needed for grid reliability, that could provide on-site fuel cells to maintain continuous power to data centers, hospitals, and other critical sites. So beyond electrolysis via zero carbon electricity, you know, hydrogen, what we're seeing is a big, and there's been some new announcements here in the United States with Sempra, one of the largest utilities in, here, that they're using, you know, they're combining hydrogen with natural gas, which is the way most of today's hydrogen supply is made. It's using carbon capture and storage to reduce its greenhouse gas impact. In the United States, we already generate 11.5 million metric tons of hydrogen per year, with an estimated value of about $18 billion. And if we in the United States reach the targets that we have set for hydrogen, we could reach about $140 billion per year in revenue, which would support 700,000 new jobs and about $750 billion per year in revenue, and a cumulative 3.4 million by 2050. Now, as I said, the US, we lag behind China, Japan, the European Union in infrastructure and research investments to reach this potential. But we believe that with US Department of Energy funding for hydrogen and fuel cells, so far it's been about anywhere from 100 to 280 million, but with Biden coming on as our new president, we expect this to be substantially more. So because we believe that there is a new need for capital to build the hydrogen production and transport infrastructure to carry it to end users here in the United States. And, we realize that there are major challenges that we have to deal with here in the United States. And, we have to increase the number of fuel cell vehicles. We have to increase the number of fueling stations. We have to expand. And there's advances that are needed to blend existing natural gas pipelines, which is what that project I was talking to you about a few minutes ago with Sempra is starting to do. So it's great. We have utilities across the country that are relying on these kinds of advances to allow them to meet net zero carbon goals. One example is the Gulf Coast. We have Entergy, which is a company that works with a client of mine, Mitsubishi Power, to blend hydrogen into gas mix at its power plants and to convert underground gas storage facilities to hold hydrogen as part of its long-term decarbonization goals. So we do believe that federal and state incentives will be necessary here in the United States to build regional hubs for hydrogen. And we believe that, that there is a lot of incentive and energy to push both hydrogen with fuel cell powered and hydrogen here in the US to really be a big deal. We have, just show you some examples. We have some Plug Power just did a big announcement. They do fuel cell powered forklifts and distribution centers that are used by customers like Walmart, Amazon, Home Depot, and Lowe's. They're using about 27 million tons of hydrogen per day. They're looking at supplying more than 100 fueling stations, and it's expanding into heavy duty vehicles. They also did a deal with Brookfield Renewable Partners to supply a gigafactory that they're going to be building. Toyota and GM have also committed to fuel cells in the United States. They're testing hydrogen-powered semi-trucks in Los Angeles. We're also seeing, you heard probably that Shell, the oil company Shell, is planning, we're working on a gigawatt scale wind power driven hydrogen cluster in Los Angeles to serve as fuel cell vehicle needs. Shell is also investing very heavily in the United States in EV charging businesses, which are centered on battery powered vehicles, but using hydrogen fuel cells and EV as complementary as opposed to being mutually exclusive. We also heard, we also work with Air Liquide. They're investing more than 150 million in renewable energy liquid hydrogen generation plant in Nevada to generate 30 tons a day. So, so I think the big things, the two biggest, newest technologies here in the United States that we're dealing with are offshore wind and hydrogen, in addition to the Biden administration clean energy. So I think, Mhairi, I think I'll go back to you.
Thank you. I'd love to hear more, but unfortunately, we're actually already over time, and obviously the change in administration,
yes,
clearly bringing new moves, emphasis on job creation, and as you said, changes in tax policies and federal and state incentives. And obviously, it's good to hear the emphasis on energy storage that you mentioned, as well as that's key, and we discussed that already in the context with Matsudaira-san in relation to Japan and overcoming the intermittency of renewables, but also the exciting plans for green hydrogen and offshore wind. I think we're all going to watch it quite closely, I'm sure. As I said, we've run over time, but I would like to just ask each of the panelists 60 seconds, please not longer, but what do you think an emerging renewables country, a country that's new to renewables, can learn from your jurisdiction? What top tip do you think they can learn from the laws, regulations, and practice from your jurisdiction? Perhaps, Roland, if we could start maybe with Europe, what do you think can be taken as positive from Europe?
So lessons learned, which you think can be transferred to other regions than the European Union?
60 seconds.
60 seconds. That's it. Thank you.
Just a quick soundbite, because we are already over time.
Lessons learned. Be ambitious, I would say. Be ambitious. This is what I think is, and be committed. These are the two things I think, one can recommend to others. Practical lessons learned, I think, are difficult to really transpose, because the circumstances natural circumstances, topographic, climatic circumstances are different. So not much to transpose, and then also regulatory differences are also there. I think one learning has been taken by many in the world, which is that I think it was Germany who first established a feed-in tariff support system with two objectives, actually. First of all, supporting the economy, and developing an economic sector, a new economic sector. So the renewable energy sector, that was, I think it was in the 90s or even earlier. And that has been taken as an example by many. And the second objective was, of course, to move the economy away from fossil fuel and to reduce CO2. So yeah, but these kind of big lessons, they only happen once in a lifetime, or maybe twice. So yeah, I mean, be committed and be ambitious, I would say. Thank you.
Committed and ambitious. Thank you. Matsudaira-san, what do you think countries entering or trying to develop the renewables can learn from Japan? 60 seconds.
Thank you. So I'm optimistic about the further development of renewables in Japan as well. And as I mentioned, some developers are now trying to develop their new business model, which does not rely on feed-in tariff or premium. And so still we have difficulty in developing the renewable project, but now the costs, for example, for developing a project now can further decreasing. So the cost reduction and also the making arrangement based on the introducing the new business model, and also the government also committed to achieve the carbon neutral in 2050. So in any event, the government and developers, investors will cooperate to further facilitate the development of renewables. So I'm very optimistic about the point.
Thank you. And Neil?
Yes, I mean, I think be ambitious. All of the countries in the Middle East that I've been talking about today have sort of enshrined, aggressive targets for renewable capacities in the various areas into their sort of economic plans, whether it's 2030, whether it's 2035, or whether it's 2050, and set yourself aggressive targets. And so far, the Middle East has been very successful when you consider that it's the sort of one of the largest hydrocarbon producers around the world. I mean, of course, for Africa, it's more challenging, more countries, more difficulties. I mean, paradoxically, one of the successes of the Middle East is the ease with which they've managed to attract foreign investment and also to finance their projects. And part of that is due to the scale. They've managed to attract export credit agencies and commercial banks to fund, so far mainly solar, but some of these projects have been, world-scale projects. Conversely, in Africa, they've had the opposite problem. I mean, too many of the projects are really quite small, and of course that's been, challenging to attract commercial banks. But I mean, fortunately, there are some initiatives in Africa that are happening. The World Bank has been incredibly supportive through its scaling projects, which are basically facilitative of smaller developers, and assisting them in the whole process from sort of feasibility through to financing of these smaller scale projects, and also providing grants and loans. So yeah, I mean, be ambitious and aggressive in reaching these targets.
Thank you. And last but by no means least, Mona.
I was thinking about this question when people were, the other panelists were talking, and I think that all of them make very, very good points. I think one thing that I've noticed that I think is important going forward for the future is the importance of partnerships. And what I mean by partnerships are, and what I'm seeing a lot in the United States and in Canada and frankly, South America, is that I'm seeing companies, unlike, competitors, companies that are in different spaces completely, that are joining forces and becoming strategic partners to do a project, to get it done. So I tell people that it's important to think outside the box. Think like, who would have thought of a major oil company ever doing a partnership with a three-way partnership with a automotive industry, EV, manufacturer, and an infrastructure company to build the fuel cells. I'm also seeing, and that's a real world example. And I'm seeing partnerships in the offshore wind space here in the US, maybe because we're behind everyone else, where we're seeing just unlikely companies coming together to get to work on a project, each bringing their own advantages, whether it's money, whether it's technology, whether it's the geographical space, to really get the particular project off the ground and to scale, because the name of the game in renewables is how do we scale quickly and efficiently without, trying to be efficient with capital, with money. And that's what I'm seeing here in the US. So it's all about, so that's my word, my buzzword is, partnerships, and to look at partnerships, unlikely partnerships to make a particular project succeed.
Thank you. And thank you to all the speakers. I think, we've discussed today that renewables, regulatory and legal regimes have moved from quite generous regimes, including feed-in tariffs or similar type regulatory regimes, to more market-based approaches. I think there's a direct correlation, not just what's there in terms of regulatory and legal support and what that can do to boost the development of renewable energy, but also that the political and economic support is absolutely key as well. For the renewable sector as well, we've also discussed that the impact of COVID has to date fortunately been relatively limited, and indeed this could potentially be an opportunity to boost investment in the renewable sector. And the message I think that we just received from the panelists was be ambitious, be optimistic, partner up and collaborate. So thank you, Roland. Thank you, Matsudaira-san. Thank you, Neil, Mona, and thank you also, Blanca, for organizing the webinar. Please do contact any of us if you'd like to discuss further the different areas and jurisdictions that we've been looking at. And don't forget that we've also contributed chapters to the Renewable Energy Law and Regulation 2021, which hopefully can provide further insights if you're interested. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to wind things up, and well, thank you all, okay, all the viewers who has been watching this webinar, and also to all the speakers for sharing your excellent insights and very interesting advices as well. Be ambitious. I think it's a very, in partnership, I think it's a very good something to propose for the upcoming years. So thank you. Okay, and we will be in touch soon when the recording of the webinar is available. And please just check as well the ICLG to Renewable Energy webinar, which is a webinar, sorry, the guide that is already available online, and free access as well online for everyone to read. Okay, and anything, we will be pleased to continue working with all of you. Okay, thank you very much for participating, and all the best. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you so much.